With the return of Superman to the big screen, I want to take the opportunity to assess past incarnations that flew into our feeble, corroded minds. Join me in analyzing how these three different men of super were portrayed, and maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way. Let's kick things off with the OG of OGs, our dearest pal,
Superman.
So, turns out this version of Krypton has been overrun by crystal mommies. Outside of that, though, the prologue is what you'd expect. It's a dying planet, Kal-El's parents send him off, yada yada. What I want to highlight here is something I've always found fascinating about the Superman mythos that this movie adheres to, and that is the erasure of Superman's mom. As a comic book and superhero movie fan, I'm fully willing to admit that I had to look up Superman's mom's name for this video. For the unaware, it's Laura. Lara? Lara. To me, Lara is fascinating because she is nothing. In this intro, she contributes nothing, and spoiler alert, she's absent for the remainder of the movie, which is a very deliberate choice, as we'll come to see. Let's delve into it later, because right now, Kal-El is crash landing onto Earth and meeting the Kents.
You take things easy now, Jonathan. Remember what Doc Fry said about that heart of yours.
Surprisingly, the relationship between Clark and Martha Kent is resigned to one scene where he tells her goodbye, which isn't that different from Lara's treatment. Clark's fathers hold all of the importance, at least in this version, whereas his mothers are just background noise, essentially. The contrast is stark, especially when young Clark goes to the frozen north to build the Fortress of Solitude, and spends the next 12 years learning under his birth father, Jor-El. This maternal absence is intriguing to me not because it has weight, but because it doesn't. The movie treats these lopsided familial relationships like they're natural, which speaks to what this movie thinks is important in molding who Clark Kent is. Not his mothers, who serve little to no purpose. Yes, his foster father to some limited extent, but above all, his birth father is paramount. Jor-El is the guiding star for our protagonist, shaping him into an instrument of his design. That explicit link dovetails into some themes this movie is putting out. There's an undertone here of exceptionalism and might is right politics. Jor-El goes out of his way to boast about how Kal-El is of a superior stock, how he is a deity, and how he needs to bring light to the primitive humans, who want to be good but lack the prescience to achieve greatness. The language and framing here is very similar to colonial propaganda about bringing civilization to the dark corners of the world. I don't think it's coincidental that this Superman's theme is a military march, nor that he stands for truth, justice, and specifically the American way. Also, let's discuss this section of the movie. It is awful. It's boring, painfully slow, and worst of all, adds almost nothing. The psychedelic sci-fi elements explored here are completely asynchronous with the rest of this story. We will never see the Kent farm again, or even Jor-El. If you were late to the movie and showed up at this exact moment, you would not miss a beat, straight up. The next section, though, is straight heat. We're in Metropolis. Clark Kent is Clark Kenting, and Lois Lane is Lois Laning. Unfortunately for our resident reporter, though, she's actually in a Final Destination movie. The set of coincidences that cause her to almost fall out of a helicopter are crazy. But your boy is there with the save. We then get a montage of Soups doing soup stuff, including a scene where a mom slaps her daughter?
I told you not telling lies.
And a scene where Soup saves a plane. Hold on, why is bro posing in the back like that?
Meow.
Hey yo, what you trying to do? Superman accepts an interview with Lois and the chemistry here is top notch. The vibes are immaculate. This movie's romance isn't very erotic at all, but its romance is romancing. But what isn't romancing is this whack poem Lois thinks up while Superman is flying her around. Can you read my mind? Do you know what it is that you do to me? I don't know who you are, just a friend from another star. Here I am, like a kid out of school, holding hands with a god. I'm a fool.
Stop! You violated the law.
Anyway, Lex Luthor pushes a dude in front of a train, these soldiers assault a woman, which is played as a joke for some reason,
What?
and Lex reveals his evil plan, to bomb half of California so that the other half he bought up becomes prime real estate.
It's free real estate.
He also tricks Superman into opening a box full of kryptonite. And if you're wondering how he knew Superman was weak to kryptonite, then let me explain real quick.
Shut up!
Lex's subordinate rescues Superman, but only after she kisses him. Why did she kiss him, you may ask? And why before saving him? Well...
I didn't think you'd let me later.
Hello? Yes, this video right here. Jail time.
Lex bombs California, but Superman saves the day. However, our resident alien didn't prepare for Lois Lane still being in a Final Destination movie. Get this, Lois's car runs out of fuel at the exact wrong spot, then a fault opens beneath it, then a rock slide buries her alive.
That is the most metal thing I ever heard in my whole life. High five.
And here we get the infamous Superman turning back time scene, which is a power he uses to save Lois. As an aside, it's noteworthy that when saving Lois, Clark remembers how he was unable to save his paw, Jonathan. And even more interesting than that is that even with this unparalleled power, he still could not have saved his foster father. I don't know if that's intentional, but it is meaningful. Anyway, after saving the day, the movie ends. And I'm gonna keep it a stack with you, big dog. I'd never seen this before, and aside from the dated ideals, this movie was premium grade A beef.
What?
That means good. I decided that means good. Once the prelude concludes and Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder show up, it was like I got shot in the arm. I mean, I got a shot in the arm. The energy they and Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor bring to this is palpable. Reeve plays the dichotomy of bumbling Clark and confident Superman so well that it's a joy just to see him on screen. Kidder is funny while bringing a lot to a character that is otherwise not much to shake a stick at, as the children say. Hackman is over the top in the best way. Despite having virtually no combat, the action is entertaining and engaging. This movie has an earnestness that bleeds from its creation into reality. And that earnestness extends to our main character. Superman is interesting in that his power is treated solely as a gift, and his morals are treated as unflinchingly sound. There's no questioning of Superman by us, the military, or even the Daily Bugle. It's simply assumed that he's just. And thankfully, he is. There's no arc for Superman, no need for him to change. Yes, he does break a rule at the end to save Lois, which is a rule Jor-El imposed about not changing history. But that's treated as a callback, not a character shift. This film's idealistic take does have darker undertones, for sure though. This absolute trust in absolute power is at best a sedative and at worst a poison. But I can understand those who reach for the simplicity of its characterization. It's reassuring in a way to rid yourself of doubt and, like Lois, mimic a kid out of school, holding hands with a god. Next. Superman Returns. Fun fact, when this movie came out, I didn't actually know it was a sequel/soft reboot. I was young enough that I'd never seen any of the OGs. Unlike now, where I have one foot in the grave and the other foot in another grave. We start with Lex Luthor and his gang pillaging the Fortress of Solitude. Superman has been gone for 5 years on sabbatical to Krypton, so he's not here to protect it. Also, apparently in those years, nobody has ever tried visiting the fortress except Lex. Which makes absolutely zero sense. But here we are. And what's Lex here for again? Crystals. Also, get ready, because this movie's for the crystal mommies. Also, Lex Luthor is Kevin Spacey. Just don't think about it. And also, Kal Penn's here. But he doesn't really do anything funny. Or anything at all, really. Huh. Anyway, Kal-El returns to Earth from his Krypton trip, whereas Clark returns to the Daily Bugle after allegedly being on a 5-year-long vacation. Don't ask me how he got away with such an obvious lie. Also, turns out during the time skip, Lois got married and had a kid. Neat? Lex uses a small crystal to make a bigger crystal, which causes a blackout and malfunctions the experimental plane Lois is riding on. Soups saves the day though, don't you worry your beautifully tiny head. And pause. I find it very convenient that Clark shows back up on Earth like 2 to 3 days before Lex implements a plan that would have murked Lois Lane. That is god-tier timing. It would have made more sense if Lex pillaged the Fortress of Solitude a year or so earlier and inadvertently set off an alarm that reached Superman in the depths of space, triggering his speedy exodus to Earth. But I digress. Superman stalks Lois for a bit in a scene that is sinister. Then he takes Lois on a magic carpet ride and tries to convince her to cheat on her husband.
Bruh.
Also, we learn that he went to Krypton for 5 years without telling Lois he was leaving, which is...
Bruh.
We'll get into it later. Lois takes her kid on a boat investigation that ends up in her getting captured by Lex. And we learn his big plan, to make a big island out of crystals and kryptonite, keep that in mind, and sell some real estate.
It's free real estate.
Big island, big money, big Lex.
'Cause I'm an island boy.
Meanwhile, Lois is about to get beat up by a boat goon when... Yeah, I guess I should have known the kid was Superman's son as soon as I spotted Hollywood's favorite cuck. That one's on me. Anyway, James Marsden shows up to rescue Lois and his not son. But unfortunately, he forgot one thing. This Lois is also in a Final Destination movie. So Lex's island shenanigans cause a rock to impale the boat they're on, causing a ruckus that traps our plucky family. Jesus, this movie really likes knocking this lady around. Luckily, Soups is here to do what James Marsden could not. And pause. There's a scene earlier where Clark is on his way to rescue Lois before he notices that Lex's island is causing havoc in Metropolis, and he chooses the city over Lois, which is fine. But that scene is almost immediately followed by James Marsden saving Lois. So the movie is outlining a contrast here, whether it wants to or not. One that shows James will always choose Lois, while Clark will not. Yet Clark still rescues the family in the end, muddying the theme. So we as an audience are left to question what the movie is trying to tell us. Is James better? Is Clark? I don't know. I don't know if the movie does either. And before you comic fans show up, I know Clark can be both super and man, but this version clearly cannot. Or can. It's unclear. Anyway, Clark gets stabbed with kryptonite, rescued, then picks up an entire island riddled with kryptonite and chucks it into space. I don't know how that's possible. Also, don't worry about Lex, he got off. I mean, escaped. Calpan didn't, though. The movie ends with Soups telling his son he's cool. And, this movie was bad. Watching it back to back with the last really exposes it as a pale imitation of the OG. And the main problem is Superman. Let me be clear, Superman does not need to be perfect, but in my opinion, unless you're doing an AU like Red Sun or Ultraman, he should be pretty decent. This Superman, however, is kinda selfish. He leaves Earth without telling Lois just because it'd be hard to after banging her, then comes back 5 years later and expects her to just be there for him. And wants her to cuck James Marsden? Who would ever do that? This Superman doesn't seem as friendly or inspiring or anything. He's kinda just obsessed with Lois after doing her dirty, which makes him come across as hollow. Of note though is how power is treated in this movie versus the last. Whereas Reeves treated power as a gift, a given, a blessing for the betterment of mankind, this movie hints at Superman's power being at least partially a burden. There's a greater emphasis on the barrier between Superman and humanity. A section is carved out specifically for Clark to hover in space, listening to the suffering of the people he feels responsible for saving. What was a pure love scene in the OG is interrupted in this by Superman commenting on how the world is crying out for a savior, with the implication that his fulfillment of that role is not a choice, but a duty. A weight exists here that did not before, which is interesting. I just wish it was explored more. Because this movie, in contrast with the last, seems to argue that Superman can't do it all. In a way, this Clark is more human than the last because he is imperfect. Which is ironic because it feels like this version spends way more time as Superman than the latter. Really, this movie is a victim of two things: a studio returning to the old instead of exploring the new, and writers struggling to maintain consistent themes. Also, editing realm spinner here, I just realized how much of this movie I cut from this review essay, whatever. There's just a lot of this movie that is dead space that doesn't really add or mean anything. Here are some of the scenes that were cut. One of the biggest criticisms this movie received at the time is that this movie is boring, and I full-throatedly agree with that. It's shocking how much emptiness this movie has when something that came out 20 years earlier kept my attention for most of it, except that god-awful intro. I think that emptiness comes from this movie lacking enough confidence to be itself, while simultaneously having enough audacity to seemingly introduce threads that would be followed up upon in a sequel. In a way, it kind of mirrors Superman's relationship with Lois and makes me dislike this thing even more. Anyway, back to it. Also, why was Kal Penn in this? Man, who even directed this? Oh no. Man of Steel. This movie starts with a more action-packed, flashier Krypton, and two key differences. One, this version of Lara gets more dialogue and has a little bit more to do, which I appreciate. And two, Zod is here and shanks Jor-El before getting exiled to the Phantom Zone, which, ironically, saves his life. Right off the bat, I appreciate both of these changes. Flowers earned, flowers given. We cut to Clark, who is now a drifter that is absolutely yoked. This section zigzags between past and present to outline Clark's upbringing, so for the sake of this video, let's just get the past out of the way immediately. In our first scene, a young Clark is overwhelmed by his growing powers, but he's able to recover when Martha Kent talks him through honing in only on what he wants. In our second, young Clark saves a bus full of kids and is lectured by Jonathan about it.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
Then gets told he's an alien. In our third, Jonathan gets hit by a tornado after telling Clark not to intervene. And in the fourth, Clark refrains from fighting bullies and gets a talk from Jonathan about becoming whatever man he wants to be. This either should have been rearranged to be the second flashback to maintain thematic progression, or cut entirely since it doesn't add much, but whatevs. These flashbacks make this iteration very distinct from its predecessors, because they let us see Clark's development far more, and it is harsher. This world is darker, and as such, adds an element where the Kents are even more afraid of Clark being taken by the government. That fear and mistrust is certainly indicative of the radically different climate this movie was produced within, and reflects an overall grimmer outlook. Cavill's Superman is convinced by Jonathan not to take action, not to be an interventionist, which is the opposite of how Reeves was raised. There is light here, though. The Martha scene builds a stronger bond between mother and son than either of the previous movies did, and positions her as an equal or even greater influence than Jonathan, which I appreciate. In the present, Clark discovers a Kryptonian scout ship, as does Lois, but she gets injured, rescued, then left out by Clark for polar bears to eat. Clark learns his origins from his hologram dad, and also learns how to fly in a sequence that is the most fun we're gonna get out of this movie. That fun concludes though once Zod arrives and demands that Clark surrenders himself, which our hero does, along with Lois, who escaped the polar bears. Zod outlines his evil plan to terraform Earth, and let's pause here for a second. I find it interesting that this movie kind of inverts the hidden themes of the OG. In the OG, Reeves' Superman was of a superior bloodline, bringing civilization to an uncivilized world. Whereas that same intention is assumed by General Zod, and to a lesser extent even Jor-El, but is portrayed as villainous. The methodologies here are different, but the underlying themes are the same. Neat. Lois escapes the ship via Jor-El's hologram, but a polar bear damages her pod. Clark rescues her, then battles Kryptonians across Smallville, destroying 70% of the town. Foreshadowing. Zod starts terraforming in 2 locations, forcing our heroes to split up. Clark destroys one device in a scene that is, I'll admit it, very cool, while the humans destroy the other. Also, Clark destroys the last Kryptonian embryos, which dooms his race and makes Zod go nanners. Our final battle begins, and let's pause here. One thing I find noteworthy is how violent this Superman is compared to the others. I don't think Reeves or Ruth ever threw a punch, but Cavill is very cavalier with his hands. What? Don't boo me, how dare you! The scope of this Superman's power is heavily focused upon the ability to destroy, not save. His first scene is him rescuing hot, sweaty, blue-collar men, but then he destroys this guy's truck, he destroys Smallville, and he super destroys Metropolis. To me, this is indicative of a fascination less with Superman's tendency to inspire or protect, but rather a fixation upon his raw strength. That focus alone molds this into a much more violent movie. And speaking of, Superman snaps Zod's neck. Then the story ends with Clark scoring a job at the Daily Bugle. Planet. And this movie is better than I thought it'd be. I might be giving it more credit after coming off Superman Returns.
You what?
But I feel like Man of Steel is a film that doesn't try to be OG Superman. And it flourishes because of it. There's a lot here that I like. Martha being more of a character, the inversion of the colonial themes, although Superman does still act as a strong man, and the neck snapping. But there are also flaws that I do have to acknowledge. In the context of this movie, the neck snap is fine. But what I was hoping for was for this moment to be a learning experience for Clark. I thought this necessary evil would drive Clark to be even more heroic and even more determined to save everyone, even villains. The guilt of culling the penultimate Kryptonian would be something Kal-El carried, first as PTSD, then as a lesson to be better. But, if I'm remembering accurately, it's not really acknowledged or even considered bad beyond its initial scene. A direct sequel might have explored it, but that wasn't in the cards for whatever reason. Also, this movie prominently features the US military in a mostly positive light. There's a whole subplot where Stabler from Law & Order SVU defeats this alien lady, which is fine? ? There's a rabbit hole to dig into of how Superman becomes more of an interventionist while simultaneously gaining the favorability of the military, but I'm gonna leave it alone and just say that the military's presence here does at the very least fall in line with this movie's more violent and bleak tone. That brings us to what you can call the omni-analysis section of this video. First off, ranking. Easy third place is Superman Returns. The other two are more difficult though, because they're so dissimilar and are trying to do radically different things. Honestly, I was surprised by how much I liked both of these movies. But if you put a gun to my head, I'd say that Superman did what it wanted better, but I like what Man of Steel is doing more. So I'll place Man of Steel at number 1 and OG at number 2. But it's more like number 1 and number 1.1, if that makes sense. What this marathon has shown me is a path. One that starts in the late 70s with Reeves and ends in the 2010s with Cavill. The Supermen very much reflect the times and shifting atmosphere of the world around them. Reeves is full of hope and boundless potential and infinite strength, but hides an undercurrent of imperialistic ideologies. Ruth feels like he needs to be the world's police, but is starting to feel the consequences of that role, while also wanting to return to a simpler time that he can never really reach. And Cavill is almost an isolationist, almost doesn't even become a superhero, and actively combats an encroaching party, while still honoring the military, boasting peace through strength, and doing 9/11 11 times over. A through line exists here that creates time capsules for these periods, allowing us to look beyond just what's on the screen. I find that fascinating, and I hope you do too. That's all for this one. Like and subscribe, because I've got more rewrites, fixes, essays, and whatnot in the works. And until the next one, cheers!